Welcome, my signature start line. All right, we're going to finish up chapter 24. There's kind of a lot of terminology in chapter 24, but what I really want to do is just explain the fundamental concept that section 3 discusses and goes into detail on, and then we'll talk about kind of the fundamental concept of section 4. And that's it. From there, we will look at the data that's actually behind the screen here. And if you're online, I will post a picture of that data. And in here, you'll add them up, write it down, and then work through the rest of the lab. I changed the coursework page so that'd be variations in population lab, which is what we got the measurements for last time, is not due until Friday. And it may say beginning of the class Friday, but as long as I get it by the end of the week, I'll be fine. So in this section, they're talking about kind of an unusual concept, which are hybrid zones. And you may be somewhat familiar with this. I think in the fishing world and in the birding world, if you or your parents or people you know are either into fishing or bird watching, sometimes people really good and really involved in one of those endeavors can identify hybrids, which are the babies of kind of two different varieties of organism. So sometimes you can get two birds that are very similar. I mean, we're not talking about separate species even, but two very similar birds that, you can see a difference between, and then they will produce offspring in a region in the middle of their two ranges. Now, I think with hybrid zones, it's easiest to look at kind of actual diagrams and maps of a situation like this. And these are going to be toads that are found in Eastern Europe. And you have yellow and red, or I guess yellow and like a burnt orange, that represents two different types of toad that are very similar to one another in a lot of ways, but they do have kind of a noticeable difference in color. And here they're called the fire-bellied and the yellow-bellied toad. So you can see that there are a lot of similarities, but they are different, significantly or noticeably different populations. Now in red here, you have kind of the boundary between the range of one toad and the range of the other. And this boundary represents what we call a hybrid zone. And in a hybrid zone, you have members of these two distinct populations that are actually interbreeding and producing hybrid offspring. So the toads you find in, some of these are pretty narrow bands of area, but in this narrow band, a lot of the toads you find will actually be a hybrid of the two different populations. Now, the reason hybrid zones are important is because they may cause these two different parent populations, is what they call them. These parent populations might be isolated even more from each other because of this zone, but sometimes the opposite effect happens. So there's really three possibilities that happen. So at one point, we probably would make the assumption that these two toads were more similar than they are today, and that they were in populations that freely exchanged genetic information, and they were the same species, or at least the same variety, maybe like a subspecies. At some point in Europe, with this toad example, one population differed from another enough that they kind of became their two different varieties or strains of each other. So this might be the fire belly, the redder one, and this might be the yellow bellied one. Now, what happens in these hybrid zones, there are three kind of results of where a hybrid zone can lead. And that's where you have reinforcement, fusion, and stability. And I just kind of want to go through them. Your book does a really good job of describing these different possible outcomes of having a hybrid zone and giving examples, like real life examples of these different possible outcomes. There's just one, I don't want to say trick, but sometimes it feels a little backwards. So I want to kind of go through them pretty quickly. So here we see the two different strains or varieties that exist. So this could be the red versus the yellow coloration in these two toad populations. Reinforcement is the result of what we would call a strong barrier. Sometimes these hybrid zones actually help to further isolate the two parent populations from each other. And I don't know in the toad example if we know yet what the result is, but you have the red and the yellow variety. If this is a strong barrier that isolates these two populations, then the eventual outcome will be these two populations will begin to diverge more and more and more. And if you come back 10,000, 10 million years from now, or whatever time frame, you will find that they've become even more and more different. Maybe they're not just going to be a slight difference in color, but have even more differences. Now, a strong barrier that reinforces the separation is caused by weak fitness in the hybrid. So if the hybrid that is produced, if these kind of crosses, the offspring that are crosses between these two populations, if they are not successful in their environment and they have what we would call weak fitness, that actually makes a strong barrier. Because here's the deal. These two populations are separating because they're not exchanging genetic information with each other. All right? Well, if when they do exchange genetic information, the result is a weaker fitness in the offspring, then that organism or these organisms that live between them are not going to survive and reproduce enough to allow genes to move between these two populations. The more genes move between populations, the more the populations will be similar. The less genes move between populations, the more different they become. So you get a strong barrier between populations if the hybrid zone is made up of offspring that don't do a good job of surviving. Because then they're not around to exchange genes between these populations. So that's where it's kind of weird. So these zones can act like a strong barrier and separate these two populations from each other, kind of reproductively and genetically. But it's usually a strong barrier because the individuals that live there are not good at surviving and reproducing. They have low fitness. So that's where it kind of feels like it should be the opposite. Now, in the case where the hybrids that are produced in this zone are more fit, when they are, when they have even more advantages than either of these populations, well, they proliferate. And there's a lot of them. And they can easily survive and mate with members of this population, members of that population, and genes are transferred around the zone. So what's kind of fascinating is that if these are really successful hybrids, then they will survive and reproduce more. And that's actually a really weak barrier. And you can get what's called fusion, where these two populations and the hybrids they make all just kind of become the same population again. And anything that may have been separating them is reduced, and they become more alike, and eventually maybe merge back into one single variety. So those are kind of your two common examples. There's then this third example of a stability when it comes to these hybrid zones, or the outcome they can give, in which there's a lot of reasons for this, and your book goes into them. But essentially with stability, you have two distinct populations, and the hybrids they make just kind of maintain their own uniqueness. Whether they're better or worse at surviving in the environment, they just the hybrid zone stays around in kind of an equilibrium. That is all what section 3 is dedicated to. Section 4 is about speciation. Speciation. This is a term I will use quite a bit, or that you'll see quite a bit in the reading especially, and I'll use it some. Speciation means to create a new species. So again, if two populations are becoming isolated, given enough time, one or both of those populations can become so different that they're clearly not the same type of living thing as the other, and we would call them separate species. And that's called speciation. When you actually find a completely unique population that's totally different from its ancestral populations, and you have what we would call a new species. This gets tricky because we don't even have one definition for species. It's hard to define. We have multiple definitions, which you've all read about in your reading, right, guys? Yes, excellent answer. So that's what section 4 looks at. And there's basically two models of long-term change that exist out there. And I just kind of want to throw these two out. This is the last slide, and then we've covered all the fundamentals of chapter 24. But over long periods of time, there's two ways we look at big changes over long periods of time. And there's been two models proposed, and like most things in science, the truth probably lies in both of them. It's not to say that one model is right and one model is wrong, but what we find in the fossil record is evidence for both of these manners of change. You probably think of evolution as a very gradual change. A single population splits, and then very gradually you might see a very slight color change. And the years and generations and, millennia later, there's another slight change. And these slight changes will add up eventually to a very distinct difference between the two populations that diverge from one another. That is the gradual model, and it's probably how you think of evolution working. But there is evidence that over vast periods of time, you can get a significant break in a population very quickly. Now, I would say this is less likely to happen than any single tiny change, but there is some indication in the fossil record and data that exists that you can get in one generation or just a few a very big difference in some of the individuals that proliferates very quickly, and that's called a punctuated model. Not every evolutionary path has to be a slow, grinding, marginally different change over millions of years. You can probably see major changes arise very quickly given the proper circumstances. So the end of chapter 24 kind of compares these models, talks about speciation a little bit, and that's where we're going to stop today. The rest of today, you should have time for totaling up this data that you probably can't see on the video very well, but I'll post it online, and working through the lab variations in populations that's on your coursework page. Also on the coursework page and up here, I have graph paper. You will need to make 2 graphs. One will be with the data we collected, and then later in the lab, there's some data that's given to you where you'll do 2 plots on one sheet, comparing like height in males and females. So we're going to stop there. You can stop the video. Goodbye.